You'll see a lot of headlines telling you China is winning the renewable energy race, or that what it's doing should terrify the West. Let's skip the alarm and just look at what's actually happening, because the real numbers are more interesting than the scare version, and more complicated too. Start with manufacturing, because this is where the dominance is genuinely extreme. China controls roughly 80% or more of global manufacturing capacity across almost the entire solar supply chain, polysilicon, wafers, cells, and finished modules. Wind turbine manufacturing is similarly concentrated, though less extremely so. And in batteries, two Chinese companies alone, CATL and BYD, supply more than half of every electric vehicle battery installed on Earth, with China as a whole accounting for over 80% of global battery cell production, according to the International Energy Agency. This isn't emerging dominance, it's already happened. Now the deployment numbers, because they're just as extreme. In 2025 alone, China added roughly 315 gigawatts of solar and 119 gigawatts of wind capacity in a single year. To put that in perspective, that solar figure alone is roughly 3 times the UK's entire electricity, generating capacity from every source combined: gas, nuclear, wind, solar, everything. China hit its official 2030 renewable capacity target of 1,200 gigawatts 6 years early. Combined wind and solar capacity in China has now overtaken its combined coal and gas capacity for the first time in the country's history. Here's a genuinely accidental discovery buried in all that desert solar building. In Qinghai Province's Talatan Gulbi Desert, an area so badly eroded that nearly 99% of it counted as desertified, engineers weren't thinking about farming when they started covering hundreds of square kilometres in solar panels back in 2012. They just needed somewhere flat, empty, and sunny. But the panels changed the local microclimate almost by accident. They cut wind speeds, reduced surface water evaporation by 20 to 30%, and the water used to wash dust off the panels adds moisture back into the soil underneath them. Grass that hadn't grown there in decades came back. It came back so well, in fact, that it created a new problem. Grass grew tall enough to shade the panels and cut their output, and dry grass in winter became a fire risk. The fix was almost comically simple: let local herders graze sheep underneath. The sheep keep the grass down, their manure fertilizes the soil for the next season's growth, and herders now earn a real income from flocks grazing land that was unusable a decade earlier, in some documented cases multiplying a family's income several times over. It's since been given its own name, the PV sheep model, and it's spread to more than 500 solar sites across the country. In some newer desert projects, particularly in Xinjiang, operators are going a step further and experimentally growing actual cash crops underneath the panels alongside the livestock. None of this was the plan. It was a side effect of solving a dust and wind erosion problem, discovered because someone had to explain why grass was suddenly blocking a solar farm's output. Unlike the EV story, the root cause isn't environmental idealism either, it's economics. Solar got cheap enough to build at colossal scale, and China happens to have enormous stretches of empty desert to build it on, land nobody wanted for anything else. Put those two economic facts together: cheap panels, abundant worthless land, and the ecological recovery underneath them wasn't the goal. It was a bonus nobody was chasing, discovered only because the cheapest place to build solar turned out to also be land that, once shaded and stabilised, could grow something again. Here's where the myth part comes in though, because the story most people tell about this stops right there, and that's not the whole picture. In that same period of record renewable growth, China also commissioned about 78 gigawatts of new coal power capacity in 2025 alone. More coal power capacity in 1 year than India built in the entire previous decade. Construction starts on new coal plants hit a 10-year high in 2024. This is happening at the same time as the renewable boom, not instead of it. So which is the real China energy story, the renewable superpower, or the world's biggest coal builder? Genuinely both. And understanding why tells you more about how this actually works than picking one narrative and ignoring the other. Why build coal and renewables at the same enormous scale simultaneously? Partly it's energy security, After serious blackouts in 2021 and 2022, provinces want generation capacity they fully control locally, rather than relying on renewable power transmitted in from somewhere else. And coal specifically, rather than gas, is the natural choice for that. China holds around 13% of the world's coal reserves and is comfortably the largest coal producer on Earth, importing only about 6 down to 7% of what it burns. Gas is a different story. Domestic supply is limited, so most of it arrives by pipeline or shipped LNG, both far more exposed to geopolitics and price swings than digging coal out of the ground at home. Coal is, in a very literal sense, the one fossil fuel China doesn't have to depend on anyone else for. Partly it's also local economics. A coal plant keeps investment, tax revenue and jobs inside a province, in a way that importing clean electricity from a wind farm 1,000 miles away doesn't. And partly it's simply that Chinese electricity demand is growing so fast that renewables, even at this scale, haven't been covering all of the increase on their own. Coal is filling the gap rather than replacing anything yet. Coal's share of the electricity mix is falling. It's dropped from around 73% a decade ago to roughly half today. But the absolute amount of coal power hasn't been falling anywhere near as fast, because total demand keeps climbing underneath it. So what's the actual myth here, and what's the actual lesson? The myth is the idea that China's renewable build-out represents some kind of coordinated green conversion, a country choosing clean energy the way an environmentally minded country might. It doesn't. It's industrial and energy security strategy first, with the climate benefit as a secondary effect rather than the primary goal. That distinction matters because it explains the coal paradox. There's no contradiction if the actual goal was never decarbonize as fast as possible, but rather build as much generating capacity of every kind as fast as possible, using whichever technology is cheapest and most controllable at each point. And nowhere is that economics first, green banner second pattern clearer than on the roads. If you watch the 2008 Beijing Olympics, you'll remember the story. A city so polluted that marathon runners were genuinely worried about racing in it, athletes wearing masks off the track, factories shut down for weeks just to get the smog low enough for the cameras. Go to Beijing today and that's largely gone. PM 2.5 pollution has fallen by more than half since 2013, and blue skies that were once a strange novelty are now just what Tuesday looks like. That's a real, measurable and genuinely impressive change. But the trigger for a huge part of that change wasn't an environmental awakening. China's government identified electric vehicles as a strategic priority back in the mid-2000s for a much colder reason. It had already concluded it could never really catch up with the West and Japan on internal combustion engines. Decades of head start, entrenched supply chains and patents made that a fight China was always going to lose. But an EV has no exhaust system, no complex transmission, no decades of accumulated engine expertise to outbuild. It's a battery, a motor and software. That's a race China could actually win by starting at the same point as everyone else, rather than decades behind. Layer on top of that China's other structural problem is the world's largest oil importer, and for decades that dependence has been a genuine strategic vulnerability. Every car running on electricity generated domestically is a car that isn't burning imported oil. It's not a coincidence that China's oil demand fell in 2024 for the first time in 20 years, with the rapid rise of electric vehicles identified as the main cause. The result: electric and plug-in vehicles now make up around half of all new cars sold in China, and China alone accounts for roughly 2/3 of every new energy vehicle sold on the planet. Cleaner air was a genuine welcome side effect, and yes, a useful thing for the government to point to. But the underlying driver was a car industry that couldn't win the old game, competing for a new one instead, while quietly reducing a dependence on foreign oil that had worried Beijing for decades. Green was the banner, industrial strategy and energy security were the actual reasons. So what's the actual lesson in all of this? The genuine lesson, the part worth learning from rather than fearing, is what happens to cost and speed when manufacturing gets built at this scale. Chinese solar module prices have fallen so far that solar is now cheaper than coal in more than half of China's provinces without subsidy. That's not a political choice. That's what sustained industrial investment in one technology at a scale nobody else has attempted actually does to a cost curve. The lesson for everyone else isn't copy China's energy mix. It's understand that manufacturing scale is itself a form of energy policy, something most Western climate strategy has historically treated as a side effect rather than the main lever. Not terrifying. Not a simple green success story either, just a country running the largest energy build-out in human history for its own reasons, at a speed and scale that changes the economics for everyone else, whether they meant it to or not. If you found this useful, hit subscribe for more of these, and a like genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think.